Hello, and welcome back to part 5, I think, of our series on how Disney destroyed the Star Wars franchise. So far, we've covered the abuse of the Force, the misuse of hyperspace, the beating to death of Order 66, and the general stupidity of almost every character that reflects the incompetence of the writing behind them. Today, we're going to discuss the derivative stories Disney told in the sequel movies. You're likely aware of the similarities between The Force Awakens and A New Hope, but the problem wasn't limited to TFA. We're going to go through all 3 movies in the sequel trilogy and point out how each tried as best as it could to emulate a movie that came before it and look at why it failed every single time. Let's begin with The Force Awakens. We're not going to start with the opening plot point or even the opening scene. We don't have to go further than the very first shot, a massive Star Destroyer overtaking the majority of the screen. I don't hate the shot, I actually think it's pretty cool, and in a better movie it would be a really good opening shot. But unfortunately, it was in this one. The actual plot starts with a stormtrooper assault to find some super secret data that a hero has stashed in a droid and sent off into a desert planet. At the tail end of the battle, an ominous masked figure dressed all in black enters the area and interrogates people about the whereabouts of that information that has been stashed in the droid. He even kills the man we see him interrogating. Meanwhile, the droid has made its way to the character who we will end up following as the hero of the trilogy. A poor desert dweller who has no idea either that they are Force sensitive or that they have a legendary heritage. Okay, before we move forward, we need to pause because 2 of these points are already problematic. First, when Leia sent R2-D2 down to Tatooine, the Empire not shooting down the escape pod aside, she knew Obi-Wan was down there. The droids weren't even looking for Luke. Luke's uncle bought them as they were searching for Obi-Wan. In The Force Awakens, Poe sticks the piece of the map in BB-8 and sends him rolling off into the desert to basically wander around until he most likely just ran out of charge and stalled in the middle of nowhere until either the First Order managed to find him or he just never got found. Poe says he'll come back for him, but he immediately gets himself captured. It's just sheer dumb luck that he happens across a character that turns out to be basically a god. And this is necessary because the Resistance sent one single pilot to retrieve the most important map in the galaxy. Second, Kylo murders Lor San Tekka on the spot. In fact, I said he kills the man he interrogates, but he really doesn't interrogate him. He actually doesn't even ask him a single question. He tells him he's going to give the map to the First Order, and when Old replies by telling Kylo that he didn't rise from the dark side, he just kills him. But it was cool when Vader did it, so it must be cool when Kylo does it, right? Well, no. Vader had an entire ship full of people he could torture who presumably knew about the Death Star plans. Kylo murders his only lead. This is just a random village, and Lor San Tekka is just a random dude as far as we're informed who somehow has a map that leads to the first Jedi Temple. He's working alone. Now a sequel apologist might claim here that, well, he could sense Poe nearby, so he knew he could kill Old. Did he though? Or did he sense the script? Now, you'll notice one thing that is conspicuously absent from my criticism here, and that is Finn, the conflicted, soon-to-be turncoat stormtrooper. That was original and a very cool idea to explore. They just then proceeded to do absolutely nothing with it. Moving on in the plot, masked/helmeted Sithman tortures a good guy aboard his ship for information. That hero then gets saved by another hero who is wearing stormtrooper armor. Now I know there's a major difference between Luke and Han wearing stormtrooper armor as a disguise and Finn betraying the First Order to help Poe. Still a similar story beat, and I'm not here to give the sequels the benefit of the doubt. That time has long since passed. Also, and we talked about this in the last video in this series, Kylo torturing Poe versus Vader torturing the rebel soldier. Kylo could have tortured/interrogated Poe on the spot on Jakku when he knew the plans must have been in about a football field radius. Then instead takes him on the journey back into space so he can torture him and inevitably make the return journey back down to Jakku where the map must necessarily be. Same plot point, different execution that makes this trilogy's villain look like a chump. Now back down on Jakku, the protagonist meets her new ally in a skeezy desert town and they escape the stormtroopers on the Millennium Falcon. Now, here's as good a time as any to address one of the few counter-arguments that one of the dwindling sequel defenders could make. They could make the point that the classic hero's journey is relatively similar no matter what. The defense would basically amount to, yes, The Force Awakens is similar to A New Hope, but that's not because J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy and Disney writ large are uncreative, myopic donut holes, as much as it is because a hero's journey in one sci-fi universe is bound to look similar to another hero's journey in the same sci-fi universe. But I'm not describing just general plot points that make up every hero's journey. I'm pointing out how every single one of those points was executed in such similar ways. They even used the same ship to escape.
What the hell is an aluminum falcon?
And have a similar dogfight that the heroes have later on in A New Hope. And of course, it was done worse in TFA because a ridiculous slew of connections needs to be provided to explain why the Falcon is even on Jakku. And of course, J.J. Abrams forgot that there's supposed to be a First Order ship orbiting the planet that would know to look out for the area that they left from on Jakku. Next, the hero of the trilogy meets the old man who instantly becomes her mentor. This man informs her of the reality of the Force and takes the protagonist as his pupil. They visit a cantina to talk to someone that can get the protagonist where they need to go. Meanwhile, the bad guys use a super space weapon to destroy a planet, except it's J.J. Abrams, and the only way he knows how to add stakes or differentiate his movies is with... So it's a bigger super space weapon, and instead of destroying one planet, it destroys 5. And of course, it's done worse. In A New Hope, Tarkin destroys Alderaan to torment Princess Leia and strike fear into the rest of the galaxy, something we understand. In TFA, however, Hux destroys the planet or planets that house the Republic. The entire Republic. And I'm not sure why I'm supposed to care, as the Republic hasn't existed in this story or really even been mentioned up to now, except in the title crawl to mention that they're basically useless. Like when I saw this in theaters, I thought they had just destroyed Coruscant. I think someone says at some point it's the Hosnian system, and I legit just assumed that Coruscant was in the Hosnian system and that was something I was supposed to know. But no, it's an action that has no weight whatsoever, just a means to explain why after the triumph of the heroes in Episode 6, the de facto Empire is still the ruling power in the galaxy, so we can tell the same story again. Oh, by the way, whilst in said knockoff cantina, the protagonist is gifted a lightsaber. But again, not only is it a lightsaber, it's the exact same one as in A New Hope. How?
A good question. For another time.
Well, apparently Maz Kanata swam through a planet of Tabana gas and fished it out.
I walked through blood and bones in the streets of Manhattan.
Or it's just a replica she bought at Galaxy's Edge. So then, after the hero gets taken prisoner aboard the super space weapon, where, by the way, she is tortured for information, the other hero and the old mentor go on a rescue mission to save her and disable some of the station's defenses, during which the old mentor has a confrontation with the big bad wolf of the trilogy, someone with whom he has a long, intimate history. During the confrontation, the mentor lowers his defenses and allows the big bad to kill him while the protagonist watches. In A New Hope, Ben does it so that the trio will take their opportunity to escape. In TFA, Han just does it in what I guess is a futile attempt to turn Kylo back to the light side, on a ridiculous, albeit very cinematic, catwalk over an inexplicable abyss. In fact, both of their bodies end up disappearing. Then the good guys launch an assault on the super space weapon and engage in a trench run to destroy the weapon's reactor core. Also, the protagonist calls upon the Force to win the day, and the aluminum falcon saves them at the last second. So yeah, that's basically the same movie. I mean, if they weren't under the same company, it would be blatant plagiarism with how many story points are copied almost line for line, unless they classified it as parody, which honestly TFA could probably get away with. So okay, if TFA copied a myriad of its plot points from A New Hope, how come TFA sucks? A New Hope is good, why isn't TFA just good but unoriginal? Well, the atrocious world building of the entire sequel trilogy will eventually be its own installment in this series, so subscribe so you don't miss it, but even if you were to isolate A New Hope from the rest of Star Wars and do the same with The Force Awakens, A New Hope would be a far better movie. In fact, it would have probably taken audiences 5 minutes rather than 5 years to realize how bad TFA was. I'll explain the problem very simply. Yes, the plot points are almost identical in perhaps the majority of cases. It's one simple question that threatens to, and actually successfully does, undo the entire story. Why? Why do these beats happen? What connects them? The writers of South Park explain this in very simple terms. It's basically a creative writing 101 concept.
What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but. Okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No. It should be this happens, and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens.
So let's see if we can apply that to A New Hope and The Force Awakens and see how they go. Here are the plot points that open up both movies. Let's see what words belong in between each point. The Empire, led by Darth Vader, ambushes the rebels to find the stolen Death Star plans. Therefore, Princess Leia stashes the plans in a droid with a message to Obi-Wan Kenobi and sends them down to Tatooine, where she knows Obi-Wan to reside. Therefore, Darth Vader cannot find the plans on the Tantive 4, therefore Darth Vader interrogates the people on the Tantive 4. Continuing from Leia stashing the plans in R2 and sending him down to Tatooine, therefore R2-D2 rolls around Tatooine looking for Obi-Wan. But Jawas capture R2 and 3PO. Therefore, they end up on Luke's farm. But R2 goes off to continue searching for Obi-Wan. Therefore, Luke goes looking for him. But they get ambushed by Tusken Raiders. And then Obi-Wan intervenes. Therefore, Luke is able to safely return home. But stormtroopers have destroyed his home and murdered his aunt and uncle because they were looking for the droids. Therefore, Luke accepts the call to adventure and goes with Obi-Wan. The only time I used "and then" in that, it could very easily have been a therefore, since we know, thanks to Revenge of the Sith, that Obi-Wan is on Tatooine specifically to watch over Luke. But I'm trying to analyze A New Hope in isolation to the rest of the saga. Now let's do The Force Awakens. The First Order, led by Kylo Ren, ambushes a Jakku village to find the map. Therefore, Poe stashes the map in BB-8 and sends it off into the desert. Although I'm not sure why that's his plan. But whatever, therefore Kylo cannot find the map in the village. And then Kylo kills Lor San Tekka. And then Poe tries to shoot Kylo rather than stay hidden. And then Kylo takes Poe back to his ship to interrogate him. And I use "and then" in all of those cases because what's the logical reason for those characters doing any of those things? There is no explainable why for their actions, except to make the next thing happen. And then BB-8 rolls his way across the desert and comes across Rey. And back to Kylo taking Poe to his ship to interrogate him, therefore Finn can help Poe escape. But their stolen TIE fighter gets shot down. Therefore they crash land on Jakku. And then Finn stumbles his way to Rey's village. Therefore BB-8 recognizes Poe's jacket on Finn and he and Rey meet. But the First Order attack. Therefore they escape, but it's on the frickin' Millennium Falcon. And then Han Solo finds them. Now, I'd say I was being very generous to The Force Awakens, brushing over Finn and Poe's escape, or the luck of Poe getting thrown from the crash but his jacket remaining in the seat. But you can see how the plot really just moves from one beat to the next with little to no care taken in establishing a why for any of them. I've made this comparison before and I'll stop making it when I've found a better one. It's as though you bought all the ingredients for a recipe but didn't read the step-by-step instructions on how to cook and combine them. So you were left with just a bowl of raw chicken, uncut broccoli, garlic, and onions floating in a pool of heavy cream. Now, let's move on to everyone's favorite Catholic-hating annoying orange, Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi. This movie gets crucified for a whole bunch of reasons, and it really deserves them all, but it somehow avoids the same criticism as The Force Awakens of being derivative. I mean, I know how it avoids that. It has hyperspace kamikazes and Force Ghost lightning. Those will dominate your critics' attention. But I'll put forth that The Last Jedi is in many ways trying to be a ripoff of Empire Strikes Back. Not quite to the level that TFA tried to rip off A New Hope, but still striking nonetheless. Empire Strikes Back begins with the Empire assaulting the Rebel base, and the Rebels making their escape past the Imperial ships. That is exactly how The Last Jedi starts, except it doesn't include a ground battle. Well, at least Rian Johnson didn't copy that part of the story.
Salt.
Both movies then split off into two different plot lines. In one line, you have the pilot being chased by the Empire, because this movie literally starts morphing the factions from the sequel trilogy into the OT.
You are always scum. Rebel scum.
Unable to use hyperspace to escape. Except instead of being treated to crafty maneuvering from Han Solo, we're supposed to be on razor's edge for a snail's pace space chase predicated on one side running out of fuel. In space. They even end up putting their future in the hands of a scoundrel who makes a deal with the Empire to betray them. So if you thought Canto Bight might at least have been the one part of the movie that was unique, well, not in its effect on the plot. In the other plotline, you have the Force-sensitive protagonist on a remote planet to seek training from an old hermit Jedi who exiled themselves after a failure that threw the galaxy into turmoil, who is reluctant to give them that training, but eventually relents. On both planets, there is a spot that is connected to the dark side of the Force that the protagonist goes to against the advice of their new master and comes face to face with herself. Just one minor difference between Rey's training and Luke's: Luke actually trains. Rey doesn't. She just scolds Luke Skywalker. And in both cases, the protagonist ignores the warnings of their master and goes to face their nemesis. And they receive a shattering revelation about their parentage. And finally, at the end of TLJ, Rian circles back to the beginning of Empire and does the Battle of Hoth, complete with AT-AT walkers, speeders that are no match for them, a clock ticking down until the Empire destroys the Rebels' defenses, a barren white plain setting, and the good guys navigating the caverns of the base on their way to the Millennium Falcon. So for all the Last Jedi apologists who shrieked that us haters of the movie just couldn't stand to get anything new from Star Wars, nope. In fact, part of the reason I hated it was because it had no originality. Unfortunately, Disney seemed to be locked in on telling the story they did. The goal was to create a new generation of heroes that harkened back to the days of yore when Luke, Han, and Leia captured the hearts of the world. Unlike those gross prequel movies, ugh. A different story could have looked like something from one of the hundreds of stories that Disney nuked out of existence, like something from the Old Republic. But no, Disney is too good to have to dip into that stuff for projects.
That's a shame.
Even if they wanted to tell a story such that they could use the old trio of heroes and use Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher as nostalgia bait, did they have to try to retell the exact same story? And we'll get to the Rise of Skywalker. I'm going to talk about this first. How about some other ideas for what the sequel trilogy could have been that still involved the original trio of heroes? I'm not going to spend much time on this, I've just written down what came to the top of my head. How about a trilogy about the flashbacks we saw from Luke's Jedi Temple? A trilogy of Luke trying to rebuild the Jedi Order. You could keep Rey and Kylo Ren and have them both be students of Luke's. And when Kylo turns to the dark side and takes the Knights of Ren with him, Luke and his lone surviving apprentice Rey need to defeat them. You could basically flip the dynamic of the Jedi and Sith, with there only being 2 Jedi as opposed to 2 Sith. Alternatively, you could focus it on the restoration of the Republic, a trilogy that makes the rebels the bad guys, namely Imperial remnant cells, and the good guys the ones with the power who are trying to put down that rebellion. How do they deal with being put into the position that the Empire was in? You want to make Han Solo a bitter old grump? Give him a reason. Have him do some questionable things to put an end to the Imperial rebellion that weigh on his conscience too much. Make it a comedy. Not a comedy in the sense that it's funny, but a comedy a la Dante's Divine Comedy, a chaos out of which an ordered resolution eventually arises. Or do the same concept, but tell it from the perspective of the villain, a political fanatic who grew up on Coruscant during the reign of the Empire, the son of one of the Imperial bigwigs in that Death Star meeting in A New Hope, and believed it to be good, now being forced to assimilate back into the Republic, trying in secret to bring about the return of the Empire. Again, top-of-the-head ideas that are starkly different from the original trilogy. Some of them could be a hero's journey, sure, but it doesn't have to be. Earlier in this video, when I put a side-by-side comparison of The Force Awakens and A New Hope's hero's journeys, I was going to do a 3-way comparison between those two and The Phantom Menace. But then I remembered the prequel trilogy isn't a hero's journey. It's a tragedy. It's an entirely different kind of story. Say what you want about the prequels, you can't compare them directly to the OT like you can the sequels. Well, let's talk about The Rise of Skywalker before we go. You might think I'm going to draw comparisons to Return of the Jedi, but I'm not. You're wrong. No, I'm actually going to suggest that Bob Iger instructed J.J. Abrams to sit in on the writers' meetings for Avengers Endgame to copy the surefire hit. The similarities mostly make themselves apparent at the end of the movie, but there's also the idea of the final story jumping to multiple different places, some recognizable like Endor and Mustafar, and revisiting legacy characters. But let's play some bits of the ends of the two movies, and you tell me Rise of Skywalker wasn't trying to copy Endgame.
On your left. But there are more of us, Poe. I am inevitable. I am all the Sith.
And I.
And I
I'm all the Jedi.
Iron Man.
And it didn't work. Because Endgame was the culmination of 11 years of patient, long-term storytelling. The Rise of Skywalker was a rushed finale of a disjointed trilogy that had absolutely no coherent direction. Not a single person at Lucasfilm had any idea how the trilogy was supposed to go when The Force Awakens was released. It's the best part of watching the sequel trilogy from a meta standpoint. It's clearly just two children, man babies if you will, fighting over whose toys get to be in the sandbox. The 3 movies amount to a terrible setup of a trilogy, an undoing of everything the first movie set up, as well as generally everything that came before it, and finally an attempt to put a band-aid over everything the second movie broke while wrapping up the first movie. It almost makes more sense if you only watch episodes 7 and 9 and just assume that Luke died off screen. Honestly, Disney got exactly what it deserved from Star Wars. They shelled out $4 billion for someone else's creation that they thought would keep chugging along of its own inertia by just feeding more unoriginal stories into it. But that's not the fuel that keeps creative endeavors going. And now look how far we've come. If I had said in 2014 that in 2026, Disney would be releasing a movie about a Mandalorian bounty hunter that nobody seems to care about, you'd ask what prescription I forgot to refill. But that's exactly where we are. And you know what? Good. That's what Disney deserves.